So on the motion, this House opposes the stigma against consensual romantic or sexual age gap relationships between adults who are both at least in their mid-20s. Prime Minister, whenever you're ready.
Am I audible? Visible?
Yep, yes to both.
Any POI form not in chat, raise hand. Like do whatever, but not text. I want to sit. During the 60s, there was stigma against LGBTQ couples purely because of their own preference. We think this is inherently pervasive and it's insane. I get to choose who I'm in a relationship with because I'm a person, I can make decisions, and society should never tell me if a decision is good or bad without actually checking what happens within the relationship. Very proud to propose. The case from open government is very simple. These people are above mid-20s, therefore above 25, therefore they're able to understand situations, make meaningful decisions, and therefore these are legitimate relationships. But even in the case where these relationships are sometimes not good in opposition, these relationships get shadowed because they need to hide from the stigma, therefore you're unable to help anyone stuck in a problematic relationship. Very simple case. On the first argument, on relationships having meaningful consent and therefore being legitimate. Why does the younger person provide meaningful consent in these relationships? One, brain development finishes around 25. This means after your mid-20s, you are able to fully have a developed brain. This means you're biologically indifferent in capacity of making decisions to a 50-year-old. Therefore, if you're okay with a 50-year-old dating a 50-year-old, you should equally be okay with a 25-year-old making the same decision because biologically they can do the same exact decision. So A, they can calculate the decisions, but B, they're able to detect manipulation better than an average person in their teens. This means I can better detect if something is manipulative. Therefore, I have the capacity to understand when something will be a very problematic relationship from the beginning that wouldn't be the case before. Second, you have past experience from previous relationships. You were either in high school or even in university. You usually have had relationships, therefore you have some experience that allows you to do a cost-benefit analysis on any future generation. This means that if you can grade the relationship, notice, if opposition tells me that this is not enough, they need to explain to me why grading a relationship through past the experience gap can happen also in similar age relationships. A 25-year-old may have more experience than another 25-year-old that are making a problematic relationship. They need to prove why the unique problem of the relationship is the age difference, not the experience difference, because experience difference happens in many other scenarios of relationships. All of this proves that younger people have meaningful consent into the decisions. Why then does consent legitimize the relationships? One, status quo says that consent between adults is enough to provide meaning to a choice. But because alternatively, I don't know how you're able to label something as meaningful because you are unable to exert the metric of meaningfulness to any person's life. Maybe someone would say that a person with disability doesn't have a meaningful relation with another person because of different utilitarian metrics. This is extremely absurd. Therefore, the only way to provide meaningfulness metric is through consent because people are able to decide. Secondly, all outcomes are based on consent. If something goes wrong in this relationship, I have consented into this. If something goes good, I have consented into this. Therefore, this creates a legitimacy out of me choosing to do this, not someone forcing me to do this. On the comparative, stigma, stopping relationships from happening because I'm afraid of repercussion. This is an actual impeachment on my capacity to decide on my own relationships. Therefore, this does decrease my capacity to make a legitimate decision. Thirdly, you have more information in these cases. For example, if I want to be a gold digger, I can choose to marry an old rich wife and then let her die and then I get the money. It's a perfectly valid decision. I don't know, but it should be something that society states against. If I want to, I don't know, go out with my boss because then she will give me free time off. This is perfectly okay because I am getting something out of it that I know and I consent, and they know and they consent. Open to explain to me why, one, this is problematic, but two, why this is implicit that is necessarily happening in every relationship, no thank you, that has an age gap. They cannot say that some do, and therefore it's problematic. All of this proves that non-consequentially, we should be against stigma, given that these relationships are providing meaning to people's life and are decided in a consensual basis. Second case, on why stigma shares perfectly healthy relationships between consenting adults. Why does it hurt the younger person of the relationship? One, People consider them proxies of the other person. They have no capacity to decide on what they're doing because the other person is the smart one or the one that controls them through other means, and therefore they're only the objects of another person using them. All of this means that these people are unlikely to seek help because at that point they're admitting that they have been proxies. It's an extremely difficult decision to make internally because accepting the common opinion that you have been an object or a proxy of someone else, not a person of your own thought, is extremely problematic. This creates huge internal class, but also this prohibits you from going into any kind of counseling that can get out of a problematic relationship. Secondly, it is very apparent. You don't need to know anything about the internal function of a relationship for if you want to only stigmatize based on age. This means anyone walking around you knows of this age difference. Therefore, if the stigma exists, everyone is going to hate you, is going to go against you. This means that it also shapes your perception of the relationship as the person. Anytime you're in your own home with this person, you're likely to feel that someone would have stigmatized you had he seen you in that place. Therefore, any moment of the relationship is harmed by other people thinking of things that are uneducated and they have no access to information to explain why this is the case. Before I continue, I will take closing.
Can consent be withdrawn at any point in a relationship?
Equally likely to other relationships. Sometimes you have abusive boyfriends. This isn't regardless of age. If an abusive boyfriend can withdraw consent, it's the same in this case. You need to explain why age uniquely increases consent. But secondly, if our second case is correct, I would prove that people are likely to stop going outside and showing the relationship. At that point, you are unable to see problems in the relationship, therefore you are unable to inform people of getting out. Why then does it get to the older person? One, they're seen as perverts. This means that they're burdened by other people's malpractices of different situations across time. I should not be burdened by another person in a similar situation doing something that I would never want to do. This is principally insane, but also creates huge burdens internally. But secondly, you look like a disgrace for your family, and this is also for younger and older. If your mother sees you with an older woman, she would say that you cannot have kids. If they see you with a younger girl and you're a man, so this is pervert, you shouldn't be my son, this is not correct thing to do. All of this means that on opposition, the bad relationships going to hide you because they want to avoid the eyes of the world. This means that you're unable to actually understand what happens internally. The way an individual choice is very simple. One, I can calculate decisions, therefore I can make my own decisions, so we're ought to respect these decisions. But secondly, I don't know what they're into, I'm okay with being LGBTQ or BDSM, I should not bias or stigmatize anyone without knowing internals proud of it.
Cool. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for a fine speech and invite Leader of Opposition to commence opposition bench whenever they're ready.
Okay, am I audible now? Does my device
Yes,
have some problem? Okay.
Yeah, perfectly so.
Okay, so yeah, I will set my own timer. Okay, so I am Olo, and you may address me in any respectful way. I may not be able to take POIs at certain moments, so I will continue with my speech without answering them. As it is my first debate tournament in English, so I will try my best. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Judge, before anything else, we need to be clear about what stigma actually looks like. It is not just disagreement, but a pattern of negative assumption and also unfair judgment about these relationships. People often maybe assume that they are not genuine or that one side is being taken advantage of without understanding the individual involved. More importantly, I believe that stigma affects how people are treated, and in this case, it is very important. Friends or family may become less supportive, and individuals may feel judged or isolated. Over time, this creates pressure and discomfort, making them feel like personal choice are not respected. So it has real effect on pupils' well-being and their relationship, which is why it matters in this debate. But the second thing I think is human people still have their own choice. Still have their own choice. If the stigma exists, they will know that okay, the social environment people have some stigma against gap relationship, age gap relationship. So they knew that before, and they need to consider and decide that decide the reason why they choose this relationship. So I think they still have choice. When we talk about age gap relationship between adults in their mid-20s and significantly older partners, we are often looking at relationship where there are meaningful differences in life stage, experience, financial stability, and social power. Not everyone in this case, but one partner is usually much more established with greater financial resources, stronger social networks, and have more life experience, while the other is still relative early in their career and personal development. This creates a dynamic where decision, expectation, and even emotional dependence are not always balanced. While this relationship can be consensual on the surface, the reality is that the difference in experience and power can shape how individuals make their decision in this relationship, what they tolerate, and how much agency they truly exercise within this relationship. Opening government may argue that individuals in this age are already fully developed cognitively, their brain, meaning they are capable of making rational decisions about their relationship, but you need to sure but they didn't prove that rational decision will always made by those people, because we are going to concede that they do have the capacity to understand and make choice. However, capacity does not mean preparedness, and it certainly does not mean they have the experience required to navigate complex relationship dynamics. At this stage of life, many individuals in their mid-20s are still in transition. They may have just graduated and are still trying to find stable jobs and work and make more experiences, build financial independence, and structure their daily lives. They need to explore more. So they are still learning how to manage time and balance priorities, because they don't know what about the future, their future job. So they need to learn how to manage time and balance their priorities. This is fundamentally different from someone who is 40 or 50 or 60, who already has an established routine, a stable career, a clearer expectation in relationship. They know that what they are doing now. So this can create real practical difficulties in maintaining a healthy relationship. Not everyone, sorry, but for example, a younger individual who is not yet working full time may accept more time, attention, and emotional availability, while the older partner may spend most of their day working and managing responsibilities. This difference is not about intention, but about lifestyle. Without sufficient experience, the younger individuals may misinterpret this as a neglect or lack of care, or which leads to misunderstanding or conflict, or maybe even if they can understand it, they feel lonely, and they feel that okay, if it's correct that I need to work and learn at the same time. So more importantly, maintaining such relationship requires a significant amount of time and of effort to communicate, adjust, understand each other's expectations. For someone who is still trying to establish their own career and independence, this creates an opportunity cost. Instead of focusing on building their future during a critical period of their life, when they have just gained qualification, they need to secure stable employment or work. They are investing their time and their energy into managing a relationship that is structurally harder to sustain. Therefore, the issue is not that these individuals are incapable of making decisions, but that they are placed in the situation where the demands of the relationship exceed their current level of experience and stability. This is actually why stigma plays an important role. It acts as a signal that in correct caution, okay, they need to consider very carefully before stepping in a relationship, in an age gap relationship. They reminding individual to reflect on whether they are truly in a position to handle this dynamic before committing to them. So we think that we provide a much stronger and more realistic mechanism. We explain how life stage mismatch leads to imbalance in expectation, how financial and emotional instability creates dependency, and how the time required to sustain such relationship creates opportunity costs that directly harm the younger individual development. OG never engage with these structural issues. They simply assume that consent solves everything, and which is clearly does not. Finally, we also explain why stigma is not random or purely harmful, but actually serve a social function. It creates caution, incorrect reflection, and prevent individual from entering situations where risks are not immediately obvious. So, for all reasons, proud to be OL. Thank you.
Cool. I'd like to thank the leader of opposition for a fine speech. As I'm mandated to do, my speakers feel as an important part of the game. With that being said, DPM, whenever you're ready.
Hello, audible?
And visible, yes.
Amazing. Okay. Our case is uniquely problematic, both from the COPOI and OO, because it assumes that a perfectly reasonable consenting adult is not able to calculate decisions that affect their own lives. CO preposterously asks, can they opt out like the older person has them in a cage, and therefore they're unable to leave? I think that is deeply offensive. I will explain what is deeply offensive and why OG clearly wins the round. First question, what is the problem? Because in open government, we don't believe that there is a problem. Both are over 25, even with a gigantic age gap. This means that both have, one, the same biological ability to think and conceptualize objects. Second of all, both have relative life experience previously in kindergarten. The best response that opposition can do to this is, but obviously, one person has more experience than the other. But maybe between two 25-year-olds dating, one is a virgin and one is not. We would obviously not consider this a stigmatized relationship because both would have the ability to gain knowledge, both have the ability to gain experience. Therefore, these relationships are obviously non-stigmatized. We don't treat experience based on quantity, but on the capacity for you to share experience. Okay. Then, what does the opening opposition say on this? Opening opposition has three main problems. The first is life states. Okay, my first question to this, what is the problem? So maybe one is a 65-year-old, the other one is a 25-year-old. So one is getting like what? So one is going to get a pension in the future and the other one is not. How does this meaningfully create a problem for the 25-year-old when the other person has their own income and they're able to sustain themselves, etc.? Two problems that there is even after that. I think one, life states are pretty similar after a certain point in life, because people often just work, go back home, hang around with friends. So the meaningful difference between a 30-year-old and a 60-year-old that both work like middle jobs is not very vast in life states, etc. But second of all, since you're consenting into this and you're over the age of 25, you can clearly conceptualize that maybe in 3 or 4 years, this person is getting a pension, or whether these people have kids, and therefore you will be their stepmother or stepfather. Which, by the way, if opposition has a problem with this, they have a problem with people making kids in the age of 25 with other 25-year-olds, which we think is problematic in the first place. Okay, so life state is clearly not a problem to whether we should stigmatize relationships or not. The second problem that opposition has is money. Maybe the 65-year-old has way more money, etc. Okay, first of all, this is uncertain. So maybe the young person has more money than the old person, whatever. But let's take opposition at their best. The older person has more money and more influence. Two things on that. One, you're over the age of 25. This means you probably have a job and you are relatively stable in it. Opposition says that you need to get a job or that you are in the process of getting a job or a career. Let's assume that this is the best case scenario for all. Okay, so I don't have a job. How does another person having a job meaningfully help my own chance of getting a job? Is relatively uncertain. The best case for opposition is, then you have a sugar daddy that provides you money and you don't have to work, but then you have consented into not having a job, and you know the problems you're not having a job. Therefore, opposition needs to argue then why that is bad. So in ops world, two 45-year-olds who stigmatize like a stay-at-home mother, like this is deeply problematic analysis. The second thing is, maybe there is some power imbalance. Maybe the one person has uniquely more power, and therefore that's bad. Two problems then. One, that the fact that they have power does not mean they use the power against other people. So for example, if you're dating a 65-year-old from a different company than your company, they have literally zero power over your life under their different age. So for the best case scenario of opposition, you're dating your own boss. Okay, cool. This is not what in government we have to defend. We simply have to defend that the stigma is too generalized and it affects multiple age groups and multiple relationships that are not the minority of cases that opposition says. But even if they're your boss, you can clearly consent into the trade-off that they make, right? Like you can opt out of the relationship, and therefore we'll explain why this is more likely to happen in government and opposition in the second question. Let's weigh this. Why does this matter than anything else in debate? Opposition might bring multiple different utility-based harms. These are very speculative and up to its relationship, whether the other person has more money, whether they're in a position of power or not. Our case is universal. Simply by consenting into this, you should not be stigmatized since you're able to make this decision. And obviously, you're able to make this decision since you're over 25. The second thing is this, that you cannot calculate the harm to that. Maybe opposition says that it's problematic if they're 65-year-old and you're 25-year-old because they have kids, but maybe you want to have kids. Therefore, we're unable to determine utility based on this, therefore we should stick to what the adult wants. Okay, let's assume then that there is a problem. Let's assume that this relationship is problematic. In which area are we better able to solve it with stigma or not stigma? Why victims are less likely to seek help in opposition because of stigma? I think two main reasons. One, they're criticizing the social circles. This means that they're likely to hide the relationships from them initially, right? So if you're stigmatized, you're not going to show to other people that you're taking care of the person. Therefore, you're way more likely to not talk to them or not highlight that there is this problem maybe that exists. Second of all, you overcrowd signals. So sometimes some age gap relationships are problematic. Most times they're not. If you treat every single relationship as problematic, the actual problematic ones slip under the radar and you're not able to cut them. PY? No, I guess I don't know. Okay, all of this means then that you're unable to identify the worst case scenarios for opposition the moment that you stigmatize every single relationship. Inside government, since you only stigmatize the problematic ones, because power imbalances in both of the houses are problematic, it is likely then that you are going to criticize maybe an employee for having a relationship with their boss, but not a person over 65 in general. This means that these relationships can have way more precise help in ours with the house. But second of all, you're way more likely to seek help in ours with the house, because there is no stigma in the first place. There is no pressure for you when you tell somebody you're dating somebody older that this is something bad. So they're likely to approach the relationship in a nuanced manner. Therefore, the moment that you explain the actual bad thing in the relationship, maybe that there is a power imbalance, maybe that they exploit you, this is the most likely scenario they're going to seek out help. But I think, second of all, this makes it easier for you to opt out of age gap relationships, because you're not hiding them, and because you're not so linked to the other partner, because everybody else criticizes you, and you have to defend your own decisions. It's way easier for you to opt out. B, it is easier to get into other relationships where people are not criticizing you for your past. Therefore, it is easier to opt out of problematic relationships in open government. For all of the above reasons, vote OG.
Cool. I'd like to thank the EPM for a fine speech. Remind all speakers offering POIs is an important part of the game. Engagement is a very important part of debating, unsurprisingly. That being said, DLO, whenever you're ready to start off top half.
Before this, but closing government, I'd just like to say that I will be speaking first and Daniel will be speaking second due to some technical difficulties. Thank you.
Thank you for letting me.
Okay, am I audible now?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. What OG fails to recognize that is that time does not simply fix these problems. The entire agreements assume that an individual can make mistakes now and correct them later. However, this ignores a much more important reality, which is path dependency. In reality, decisions made in the mid-20s shape long-time life path. So this is a critical stage where individuals are building their careers, establishing independence, and maybe forming their understanding about the work outside the relationship. When because they lack of experiences, so at that time they maybe some of them will have a job, but maybe some of them only have a internship. When they invest significant time and emotional energy into relationships that contain structural imbalances, they are just not making a temporary mistake, and they are actively redirecting their own development. I think that the I think that in both work, uh, pupil and mid-20s still have their own choice. They still have their own choice, and if the relationship is bad for them, they can opt out, like OG said before. But we believe that in this time, mid-20s shape long term life path. So this is a critical stage for them to building their careers or understanding of relationships. So so they maybe they can opt out in the future, but at the same time, uh, they um um they are miss some opportunities for their careers. So I believe that this is still bad for them to go into some age gap relationship. By the time they learn from these experiences, they are already paid the cost. They may have delayed career progress, miss key opportunities, or to build independence, or internalize unhealthy relationship dynamics. These are not short-term effects that can simply be undone later, and instead they shape future decisions, expectations, and life outcome in way that are difficult to reverse. So this is also why OG respond about employment is insufficient. Even if some individual in their mid-20s have jobs, this does not eliminate the imbalance. Early employment does not equate to stability, experience, or equal power within a relationship. The gap in life stage still exists, and it continues to influence how decisions are made and how conflicts are handled and how much independence each individual actually has. What this means is that the issue is not about whether individuals have the capacity to choose, but whether they are in the position to bear the consequence of those choices. And in this relationship, the consequences are not neutral. So this is why stigma plays maybe plays a role in this match, and it's not about punishing people or judging them unfairly. Instead of it functions as a social signal that encourages caution at a stage of life where mistakes are the most costly and the least reversible. It's push individual to reflect more carefully before entering situation where these structural risks are present. So without this signal, these dynamics become normalized, and people are less likely to question them and less likely to recognize the risks, and more likely to commit to relationship that can shape their long-term path in ways they cannot simply fix later. For this reason, we believe stigma is not only justified but necessary in this case, and we are proud to stand on OO. Thank you.
Cool. Well, thank the DLO for a fine speech. Thank everyone who's half last been a great debate so far. Move to the back of member of government whenever you're ready.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
OG makes two claims. First, that there's nothing wrong with age gap relationships because consent is already there. First issue, they do not terminalize the impacts. This remains largely a principal argument with no tangible impact on the vulnerable. But second of all, does prove to some extent that choice cannot be naive, i.e. you need to consider coercion and the circumstances in which you make the choice. The second argument is the better argument, which is that you prevent people in age gap relationships from seeking help. The issue is that OG does not explain why the stigma is so powerful and who the stigma specifically impacts. Why the extent of people not seeking help is so large and something that needs to be resolved. Our argument is simple. First, we'll talk about who the stigma applies to. Second, we'll talk about how this narrative really manifests in terms of what people really think and how people view younger women in these relationships. First, who would this stigma be applied to? I think that there are largely going to be two groups of people. First, in like about 60% of the cases, probably younger women, right? Why? First, because there's alliance of conservative notions and religious beliefs that women are seductive. For example, you have biblical depictions of Eve tempting Adam, and the fact that in many religions, many people tend to view women as a person who leads to more evil and negative impacts happening. So it's cultural. But second of all, younger women are seen as the party who benefit more from the relationship because their partner simply has more resources. This is empirically true. For example, people can point to sugar daddies providing like watches and jewelry and lots of like wealth to younger women. And the truth is that like older women empirically men tend to be older in the relationship. They're likely to have accumulated more assets, which women can inherit. We think that this is true, though this does not mean that the relationship is illegitimate because there are legitimate reasons as to why younger women enter into these things. The third thing is that in Asian societies, there's often value placed on respecting older people. For example, filial piety, elders having more experience. So younger women are the ones involved in these relationships. But I think the more important thing to note is that there's actually a group of migrant brides. Every year, 150,000 women from poorer countries like Vietnam and the Philippines are advertised through matchmaking agencies. In East Asia, migrant brides actually comprise about 20% of the marriages every year in countries like Taiwan, Singapore, and China. They're often younger, much younger than their partners. They're uncomfortable entering into such relationships. They may even have had a romantic partner back home whom they really want but have to part with. They face a difficult moral dilemma, whether to leave their family behind for a foreign country they do not call home and to live with a man whom they have never met. But they're often forced by circumstances to do it. Jobs scarce in rural areas, it suffers from inequality and underinvestment. Women in particular suffering from underinvestment in rural education, which means that even like somewhat skilled jobs like factory jobs are not open to them. The demand for foreign brides is rising in many parts of the world, and is a really significant proportion of the women in like age gap relationships. The Economist recently released an article showing that most local marriages, like the average age is about like 2 years apart, right? Which shows that for most local people, there's no age gap. Why is the demand rising? This is because many countries like Brazil and India have an underbelly of older men who have not been able to marry because they're seen as less attractive. For example, poor construction workers are seen as less attractive to local women in their age group. Women tend to want to marry up. It's only natural that people want to marry someone who is seen as somewhat better than them, so that they can tell their family, well, I've arrived. And furthermore, they do depend on their partner for resources and for their family in the future. I want to note that this is exacerbated by the fact that China has had a one China policy. And notice that China is like 1 billion people in the world, right? Many women actually chose, women, especially in the 1970s, chose to abort the girls. This means that you've got like quite a gender imbalance. You've got many more men, right? Which gives a demand for foreign brides. Why is this stigma likely to be imposed on foreign brides in a much more pernicious way than younger women? So the extent of harm is greater. First, because migrant brides are unfamiliar with the local language. This creates distance and discomfort with other people in the community. For instance, because you can't understand the language, you may often make like small mistakes, right? For example, like you don't know how to order food in the canteen. This means that people would tend to distance themselves from you because you're seen as the other. But second of all, because you know that you're foreign, you're afraid to speak up. You feel less confident, right? And this like lack of confidence leads to self-inferiority. They know that they are in a foreign land, they do not know local customs. They find it hard to engage with this narrative and to dispel people's notions of who foreign brides are and who people in like these age gap relationships are. Why are younger women who enter into these relationships already vulnerable? First, there are legitimate reasons as to why women may enter into these relationships, which relate to their vulnerability. We tell you of women suffering from severe college debt who really need to enter into like a relationship because college debt would make them bankrupt if they don't. We tell you of women who need to feed their who have parents with cancer, the cancer treatment is really expensive, and that's their only way out, right? But second of all, notice that their entry into these relationships makes them more vulnerable. First, because of financial dependence. Once you've entered into a relationship, you may oftentimes, like, for example, if you're taking care of someone who is like really ill, someone who's very old, you may give up your job, spend more time with them, right? And this reduces the amount of skills that you have in your work experience. So even if your partner unfortunately passes away, even if you do leave your partner, you become dependent on your partner. You find it harder to find jobs, find it harder to market yourself in the workplace. But second of all, like because you've committed yourself to an age gap relationship, there's oftentimes emotional dependence, right? And this emotional dependence is stronger because you have basically before entering into this relationship, overcome the discomfort of entering into an age gap relationship. So you basically psych yourself that the relationship is fine. Why would it be harder for such women to seek help? I.e., why is stigma a tipping point? And notice that OG does not actually prove this. You just see the stigma will make it harder for people to find help, but they don't show you how the stigma really manifests. How do societal attitudes become more negative? First, women are portrayed as more manipulative. For instance, in How to Make Millions Before Grandma Dies, this Thai film, quite popular, you should watch it. Like there's this young nurse who's portrayed as a gold digger who wants to take the assets of the older man and who does this multiple times just before he dies. This is believable because many people know that there's a power differential and a wealth differential in these age gap relationships. Highly persuasive. But second of all, these women are portrayed as as having consented to the risk of the relationship, i.e., given that everyone knows that these relationships are immoral, are weird, are otherwise, they still chose to enter into these relationships. So for instance, when they ask their family and friends for support, their family and friends are likely to say, but didn't you know of these risks? And the very thought that their family and friends may react in this way prevents them from even seeking help in their social circles before they go to the police with their sexual assault. But third of all, by definition, like you're otherized because of stigma. Stigma happens when the majority imposes their conception of what an acceptable societal norm is. So this tends to apply to a very small group of people, but the harm is concentrated. For all of these reasons, because we fill in OG's critical missing links, we win.
Cool. I'd like to thank the member of government for fine speech. Male speakers, POI is an important part of the game. How many times are we going to say this at this tournament? With that being said, member of opposition, whenever you're ready.
Am I audible?
And visible, yes.
Great. I'll take POIs verbally. The main question to you that we'll answer is what happens after your relationship ends. You'll die, you'll be lonely, and your partner won't leave you behind. Now, the main issue we have in opening government is that they claim people in relationships are demonizing status quo. However, there are two main actors in this debate. First of all, ongoing relationships, and relationships which are ongoing with an age gap specifically, and also relationships yet to happen, as in partners who want to go into a relationship with an older person. We'll prove to you in the closing opposition why this will be worse for them as a person, also why the age gap why age gap relationships will improve in accountability later on down the line. Why is it counterfactual? Why is it so much better that we have in opening government? People are being pushed into relationships people in ages closer to themselves. What do we mean by this? We mean that as in people, the media narrative it will change. As in people will see on TV, hey, this old man marries an old woman. This is the counterfactual which we're going to be defending on our side. Why is this much better than what you hear in opening government? Three main responses. Number one, shared life experience amongst these couples. For example, historical life experience, cultural experience is significantly more similar. Relationships are more easier to attain, and the emotional bond is easier to generate when you have two people of a similar age gap working together. Second of all, there's a lack of family pressure on the relationship to succeed. You're left alone. You're left to relax amongst yourselves. There's no idea of someone imposing their ideas over you. Thirdly, life expectancy, very important in this round. When your partner dies, you'll often be left very, very lonely. At a time in life, Trump will die and Melania will be left behind just by herself. So it's very hard to marry at an older age. Relationships and bonds is very hard to achieve after you die, after your partner dies. This is very, very important, purely because after this relationship ends, people in these relationships are often worse off on the opening government side. Why is this so important in the context of the round? Because we say the counterfactual, which our opening doesn't mention, we've happier relationships on our side, and there's a better life post relationships where there's less time you spend alone by yourself, and there's significantly more time you have for a more enjoyable partner, a more enjoyable relationship, a deeper connection than you hear on opening governments. Now, the first argument. In ongoing relationships, how do you improve accountability in these situations? Very important to note how the stigma actually manifests in the actual world. Two main reasons. Number one is people proximate to those in the relationship, family and friends imposing their ideas on those in the relationship. And second of all, media narratives perpetuated in the mainstream media, saying, hey, old men are exploiting young girls, or all young girls are exploiting old men. As in we now say that people will now be pushed into this idea that any current relationship in status quo is now going to be it's now significantly more exploitative. Why is this very important? Now, the premise response we hear from OGs is that people will hate you. Now, three responses to this. Number one, people care about you more than just your relationship status. I think if my mom knows I married an older woman, she will care about me more than just my relationship. I have like an emotional bond to her. It's very different. Second of all, you're innately predisposed to care about those who are around you, your brother, your sister. There's a biological bonds between you and them, which can't be broken by going to an older relationship. Thirdly, I think those who are in these relationships currently already know stigma existed. As in they go into relationships with the idea that, hey, the stigma around this, I'm going to ignore the pressure from those outside in relationships. I don't care about guys outside who talk about my life. I'm going to just move on. Now, why does accountability improve in relationships? Two main reasons. Number one, the type of accountability actually changes. We say that instead of your family asking about your money situation or social life, they're asking about your relationship status. Are you being exploited? Do you feel happy? Are you emotionally safe? Are you like sane in the relationship? This is very important. Why? Because we say that now relationships are significantly more better because there's less accountability, less chance of emotional pressure. Now, and secondly, the persistence of these check-ins also changes. If your mom knows goes on TV, on social media and sees, hey, this age gaps are bad, then they'll now understand that, hey, I'm going to look after my son significantly more. I'm going to care for him significantly more in the relationships. Why is this very important? But there's significantly more emotional checks. People are significantly happier because of the stigma existing. The stigma exists, and now people in relationships which are bad are going to have a better life as a result of it. I'll take the POI.
We told you why younger women and migrant brides are already very vulnerable and why it's so important that they can leave a relationship. Your argument implies that accountability is more important than people having the chance to leave a relationship. Why is that the case?
Okay, I think the very, very fringe case, people being trafficked across the world. I think the majority of age gap relationships are consensual, as OG claimed. We said probably as opening claim, the majority of situations we're going to be probably talking about is probably guys marrying and probably marrying a younger woman, not for like an evil, malicious reason, but because they feel lonely, because they feel sad. I think that's the main actors in this debate, not the fringe cases you claim. Second extension, why these relationships often harmful is wishing to go into these relationships. Now, I proved to you already why the stigma benefits the group already in these relationships. However, you're a younger woman who wants to go into relationships when they're older. We already told you why the counterfactual is better with people if they don't go to them into the first place. But even then, why are people going into these relationships going to have a better life, not being in them anyway? Now, it's very important to note, we agree with the analysis in the opening of people having gaps in wealth. However, this wasn't really weaponized in the same way that we will do in our speeches. Firstly, it's very hard to opt out of these relationships in the first place. If you're dependent financially on a partner, then that means that you struggle to lead the relationship. You haven't generated this level of life experience, level of wealth as the opening claimed, but therefore you can't leave them. Why is this important? Because your partner now has a significant amount of bargaining power over you. They can ask a lot of you in a relationship, ask you to do a lot of stuff, and you can't leave them because you're very emotionally tied, like financially tied to them. Your bank account's in their name, for example, and therefore it's significantly harder to leave later on down the line. Second of all men are actually being exploited to some extent. What do you mean by this? As in many cases, there are many older rich men who are very, very lonely. They have no emotional bond. They've grown up lonely. They're like 60, 70 years old, and they want to have a relationship. And younger girls try to exploit them in some cases. Of course, this is one example of many. However, these men often lose the emotional connection which they could get of a good relationship later on down the line because they didn't blind to the stigma of the narrative in this motion. Thirdly, the most important mechanism Post-relationship life is often worse. It told you earlier in the counterfactual that many of these relationships will end abruptly, as in the partner will be 50 and the partner will be 70. The one who is 70 will die, and the person who is 50 is older, less chance to remarry, less chance to build an emotional connection later on down the line. Why is this very important? Because even if we buy into the OG's claim that it's a good relationship, it's happy and fulfilling, after the relationship ends, the partner is often worse no matter what. Even if we accept that they claim that, hey, it's going to all be okay, it's all consensual, that your life afterwards is still miserable. Your life afterwards is still lonely. You don't get the same connection as you could get on the opposition bench. Why it's so important in the context of the round? We say people are miserable. People are sad once the relationship ends, but people had in the relationships in the first place. Overall, relationships are worse if people have these age gaps in the first place. However, in the cases where they do exist, the stigma improves them. However, we tell you that we'd rather them not exist, and the world's a better place if they didn't. Thank you very much. They've been prouder to oppose.
Cool. I'd like to thank the member of opposition for a fine speech and invite the government whip to summarize proposition bench whenever they're ready.
Okay. Am I, visible and audible?
Yes, to those.
Okay. Woo. I've been awake for a long time, but everybody ready? If not, speak now. Hearing no one, I'll begin on my first word. So in this speech, maybe let's reaffirm Darrius's case. Let's do rebuttal to CO, and then we'll do like team by team, and finally like sort of explain why we win one more time. What did Darrius give you? Two main things, or really like three main things. One, we fixed the choice argument by showing that like how choice is lost. So like opening government says opening government says consistently that like stigma affects choice. People should be allowed to do what they want, but they don't really show how like stigma necessarily affects choice. OO doubted this fact, right? Making it like a link that's been doubted by the opposition when they said basically that like people will still choose to enter these relationships. This is the thing that happens. But we show like that you actually don't have a choice because this stigma is fueled by like cultural and socioeconomic effects against women, having like a certain effect that removes people's choice. As Darrius explains, choice requires a certain freedom that is lost by this stigma. You didn't prove that like there's an actual loss of freedom. They just prove that like you might have negative consequences for entering into the relationship. We prove that the stigma is strong enough to get around that. Thus we beat OG. Think about it like this, like why just the existence of a stigma isn't enough. Oftentimes people will violate stigma. There's a stigma against using the bathroom during the Deputy Prime Minister's speech. I still did it. I don't know why I wrote that. It's like a prerequisite to like the entire OG case that we prove that the stigma actually has an effect, which is something OO doubted. Darrius did this, so we beat OG right there, and like steal their impact from choice. We also show why allowing the choice matters. Let's note first that like choice in its own doesn't matter. We only care about choice in so much as it leads to us choosing good things, right? So if I put you in a room and say you're locked in this jail cell, but you can choose the color of the walls, that's something that doesn't affect you, so you probably don't feel that good about choosing the color of the walls. You care about choice because it lets you get better outcomes that you choose. Darrius shows we get better outcomes. Through the case of this sort of brides coming across. The only doubt given to this was like, this is such a niche case, but Darrius proved that this isn't true. He gave you structural reasons based on the demographics of a lot of these nations to show that this is a common thing, and even gave you statistics about the fact that like 20% of marriages in like a lot of Eastern countries are these sort of marriages that are non-local. He also showed that like most local marriages are not the age gap marriages, and that most of the age gap marriages are these sort of migrant marriages. So like these are the terminal impact, and we show like why the choice matters and why this case is. Let's also just note that like from a pure utilitarian perspective, which is what opposition has been operating on, the biggest impact in the round is the effect of these migrant marriages, which Darrius showed. Like there was no contesting from CO that like you help people in this. They just sort of tried to like minimize it, which I've shown isn't true. I've shown that like, yeah, this is the most important impact because one, it's just a lot of cases, as Darrius showed through structural reasons, through the statistic, but also even if it's not a lot of cases, this is the biggest impact. So like, if we talk about like the marriages themselves, maybe they have a bad case for a little, and then they maybe get divorced and move on to another. There's some opportunity cost loss, or like looking at Gov, maybe they lose out on like a better marriage because of the stigma. However, what we show is that there's like actual life-ruining effects to the stigma, that these people like rely on the ability to migrate, on the sort of economics of it, that they're putting themselves in this very vulnerable position. So like these people are the biggest delta, even if it's a small amount of people. The last thing that Darrius did, so yeah, one, we fixed the choice argument by like showing that there's a loss of freedom. Two, we show these like migrant brides, which are like the most important things. The third thing that Darrius did is sort of show how this stigma actually makes like marriages work. Sure.
is the average relationship a trafficked bride sent across the Middle East or Asia? Is it more likely a normal consensual one with two consenting partners of around the 20 or 30 age gap?
Yeah, I think this argument is mostly just you saying like the case very loudly and using that as a way to sort of doubt it. Darrius has shown like why his case is the most likely by mentioning just like the structural factors, by mentioning just the fact that people need to go. Just saying loudly which is more likely doesn't undo the mechanisms he gave you. So you'll have to undo those in your speech perhaps, but you probably won't be able to because Darrius is so smart. Let's talk about like why the stigma has like affects people coming for help. OG basically just says people don't like you, and that's why we provide the mechanisms that you're seen as a manipulator, that people like put the sort of choice on you, and this is seen in like OG's own case, that you get a sort of vibe of like whoso diggeth the pit shall fall therein, so people aren't willing to help you. So we show not just how like you're not willing to like go seek help, but why even if you do choose to go seek help, it's not there for you, leading to worse outcomes within the relationship. We've heard some people saying it's hard no matter what. Yeah, you're in a precarious position. You're a vulnerable person. But like there's still a massive delta if you're not able to get help from other people because they see it as your fault. So like we've shown pretty clearly that there's a massive delta on people in bad marriages, which will certainly happen because like even with the stigma, this happens. We've shown that there's a massive delta for these like immigrant bride cases. And we've shown that like there is a true loss of choice emerging under the opposition. Let's talk about like why we beat each team. OG we beat pretty clearly, but because we fixed their like main argument. Everything depends on the stigma having an effect, and we show why the stigma has an effect. We also just outweigh them. We also like provide the actual impact that leads to choice being bad. They just make a sort of libertarian argument. Well, wouldn't it be nice if we can do these things? We show why it's actually necessary that you do. Let's talk about why we beat OO and CO a little bit together first, because both of them basically make the argument that, oh, these marriages are bad. One, I'd say that there's a pretty small delta because you already have like advice and stigma against entering bad marriages, right? So your like mom is going to advise you not to marry someone who's about to die, even if it's not an age gap relationship. Two, I think a lot of what OG said is somewhat true in rebuttal to like CO's main things, which is like that like there are many cases where we'd say it's okay to marry someone who like has a shorter lifespan, who has family pressure, who maybe is very different to you, right? Opposites attract. If someone's dying of cancer, it's not like wrong to marry them. But like, and you also just have a small delta because there's already advice. So the other thing, let's continue on CO and just show that like all their things are unlikely and actually turn it. They claim that like these things will stop men because of the stigma. This is unlikely for a couple of reasons. One, as we've shown, that these things are mostly driven by like the stigma is mostly driven by patriarchy. They haven't shown anything to rebut this. Patriarchy is like the strongest force. It's unlikely to be used to check men. Also, just like look at the real world. Like many men are in age gap relationships. Donald Trump was the example mentioned. It's clearly not working because men are mostly immune from the stigma because these are mostly like very powerful men. The stigma has a very small effect on them. It has a very large effect on the woman. So we outweigh for that reason. Also, the idea that your mom's going to watch over you. If your parents care about you, they're going to watch over you either way. If the like relationship is bad, there's other signals. There's like very low delta to all of CO's arguments. They basically just rely on, oh, the relationship's bad. But like if it's bad, then there will be other alarms. We're specifically focusing on the age gap part and the stigma of that, which isn't an issue. OO basically was the same argument, saying it's bad. They do one other thing, which they say because it's a signal, you'll like look into it more. But as I've said, like there are other flags. People already think a lot about the person they're marrying. So like the existence of the signal isn't really necessary. What's much more important is that you remove the stigma so people can get better relationships if they enter into a bad relationship, which is something that will happen. So we outweigh OO, we outweigh CO. All of their arguments like are sort of unlikely and don't really matter. And OG is like relies on our fixing them from like OO and CO's attacks. Thus so proud to win.
Cool. I'd like to thank the government whip for a fine speech and invite opposition whip to summarize opposition bench to debate as a whole whenever they're ready.
Can I just check I'm clearly audible?
Yes, you are clearly audible.
Cool. I'll take verbal POIs if possible. David won this debate very cleanly because he told you that the stigma affects two actors. The first is people who are on the fence of choosing into their relationship. We proved to you that the stigma forces people to pick people who are not older, who picks people who are younger, and actuates better relationships for people on the fence. And secondly, we told you that the stigma pushes for better accountability for people within these age gap relationships. We win. The first thing I'm going to do is just build on our case on on why the counterfactual is better for relationships. We tell you the stigma pushes people to be attracted and to choose people who are closer to them in terms of age. Why is this good? 4 reasons. The first is that you're much more likely to do things such as share very similar cultures. If you are someone who is close to one another in terms of age, you go through the same life experiences. You are people who share the same culture. For example, my grandparents met each other because they were both victims to the Cultural Revolution in China. You understand the other person a lot better because you've gone through the same things. You listen to the same music. You share the same interests and hobbies. But secondly, there's just a better health. That is, when you have a similar age, you both go through similar health problems. Whereas the problem with age gaps is oftentimes one person will have deteriorating health, which reduces the attraction over time, which worsens the quality of relationship. I think it is very bad. But thirdly, you're just much more likely to have children. It's pretty intuitive, right? If you're in an age gap relationship and that age gap is presumably too wide, it's oftentimes too late for you to have children. Whereas on our side, when you're similar, can have children, they bind people together. You can create a family. That is very, very good. I think it is important. But fourthly, because of biological attraction, that is, people are tending to be attracted to people that more of a similar age to them. I think that sustains. I think it is very good. The end impact of our first extension is that we create better relationships with this stigma by pushing people not to opt into age gap relationships, which are often in the long term very bad. The second thing I want to note in terms of our extensions is that David fills out OO's burden. OO says, essentially, guys, look, young people want to get into financial careers and therefore they're going to opt in to age gap relationships for the money. They never explained as to why this is a terrible thing in terms of actual exploitation. What we told you is that firstly, richer older individuals are often those who want sexual relationships, who are more established as individuals, who are rich and bored and tired of their current lives. So they oftentimes opt for people for that sexual relationship. I'm sorry, it is true. It is exploitative. Not everyone in the world is very perfect. But secondly, younger individuals want to establish stability. It is oftentimes, as per CG's concession, young women who are necessarily living in social conditions which make it very hard for them. So they actuate and they opt into the relationship. Why is this bad? Firstly, it creates massive levels of oppression and leverage in that relationship. That is, when you have all your financial stability tied onto one person, that means that one person has much more control. It means that they can threaten you if you do not do your will. If you do not obey their orders, they will withdraw your credit card. They'll stop your expenditure. They'll threaten to literally have a divorce with you and take custody of the children. I think it is very bad. But secondly, I will note that it becomes exploitative. It's really hard to opt out of. That oftentimes once you've invested yourself in a relationship, it's often you've passed the point of no return, that you cannot opt out, because if you do so, you lose all of your money, that you've literally tied your entire financial stability to this one person, so which means that all of these women who are tied into the exploitative relationships cannot opt out because they're stuck in it.
Before this,
so they'll be left without money. Before I rebut opening government, I'll take the POI.
Foreign rights are not trafficked.
Guys, consent matters by itself. Each individual.
OG.
Opening or closing?
OG.
Consent matters by itself since each individual can determine utility and should not be stigmatized, thus being both closing tips. Per CO, all different cultures should be stigmatized. Clearly, this is crazy. Asians can date Europeans. What the fuck?
I'm sorry. The reality is, look, there is surface level consent, but that consent is often very complicated. There are reasons as to why I choose to do something. That oftentimes, even if you opt into it, you do not have the full information of that relationship. You do not know what that's going to turn out of. Lots of times people just make impulsive decisions because, look, their parents, their social narratives told them, look, it's probably a good thing. This stigma tells you, look, it's probably bad. You should probably go for someone that's similar age with you. You'll live a better life. Let's talk about CG. Their extension is insane. They talk about women in developing countries will be harmed. Firstly, I want to flip this. This narrative of that women are manipulative gets worse on their side. Why? Because there are more age gap relationships. There are more women who are now seen as exploiting older men. If there's a higher quantity of age gap relationships, that means more women are stigmatized as exploitative and manipulative. The narrative draws young women away from older men. It chooses younger men. The narrative that they're manipulative is gone. But secondly, they knife their own opening. Like, look, their opening tells you there is consent. Closing says there's no consent. There's an explicit knife here. I'm unclear as to what they were talking about. Let's talk about OG. The first thing they say is that relationships have meaningful consent, and therefore there's some level of obligation to respect that consent. As we've already explained to you, that consent is often primo facie, at surface level, that often younger women are likely to have soft social pressures which pressure them into that implicitly. They do not know that these pressures exist, but they choose to opt in, especially in developing countries, as per CG's concession, which means that once you're in that relationship, it becomes exploitative. You have internal oppression. Why is that oppression very, very bad? Notice, once you've tied all of your meaning to one man and you've literally cannot opt out of that relationship, you just feel really bad every day. You do not feel safe within the own house that you live in. That once you've opted in, that is very, very bad. The second thing they say is that, guys, look, consent is long lasting. Like, no, consent can be withdrawn. Like, look, the reason as to why sex ed talks in schools often say, look, it's illegal to like continue having sex if you pass a point of consent. If the person has withdrawn that consent, is because it's probably very important. That lots of women might just choose to opt out, but they literally cannot do so on their side because they're in an age gap relationship, which is very exploitative and it's done for the money, and that is very bad. Thirdly, age gap relationships can still happen on our side. Look, the stigma exists, but if people of opposite ages truly love each other enough, they'll stay in that relationship with or without the narrative. So the strongest bonds of love, even in an age gap, exist on both sides. This debate is people on the fence who actively have like a decision to make. We uniquely pressure them to go into a relationship with a much more happy, much safer, much better in. For all those reasons, it is a clear closing opposition.
Cool. I'd like to thank the opposition for fine speech and all the debaters for listening. A good debate. See you in 15 minutes. Please leave the breakout room.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank everyone. Wonderful. Are you still both happy to have the panel discussion recorded? You can say no, don't worry.
I'm happy.
I'm fine with that as well.
Cool. So if you want to take a minute to look over your notes, come up with initial call, and we get started.
Yeah.
I have my initial.
Hmm.
I
are
need
you ready to go?
I need a minute.
Sure, cool.
Okay, I think I have a call. Initial
Cool,
call.
okay. Yeah, so Abbie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think it is close, so I'm not entirely set on this, but right now I have OG, CO, OO, CG.
Cool. Noam?
Okay, I'm close to that, but still quite close. I tend to give it to CO, then OG, then CG, then OO, but things can
Cool.
flip easily.
Yeah, that's okay. I have OG, CO, CG, OO. So we have first a disagreement on the positioning of closing government relative to opening opposition, and then we have a disagreement about the position closing opposition relative to opening government. So we're going to focus on those two comparisons first. Let's start with the closing opposition opening government comparison. Noam, you have closing opposition beating opening government. Do you want to take a minute to describe what you think is the important determination that means closing opposition beats opening government?
I think that the main point where I think that the main tension between CO and OG is the tension between, is that relationship going to be just completely prevented, like everything bad that can happen, or it's going to happen, but we're giving a way out to opt out and things like that. I think that CO very well point out that the principal case of OG is strange in terms of what consent means and how it should work. I think that they gave two main important things here. Well, one main important thing here, and that is that those relationships can become very hard, even just because of biological matters of life expectancy, and therefore it just makes it more easy for those things to be bad, and we want them not to be taken lightly, and there the stigma will likely work.
Okay, so Abbie, do you wish to respond to that claim about the nature of the relationship?
Okay, so I think the main clash here is is it better to basically use this stigma to push people to get away from these relationships in the first place? Or is it better to not have stigma so if these relationships turn predatory, then people feel more able to access help? I think there's two things CEO will need to prove to me in order to have them over OG, although I think it is close. I think they need to either prove that the majority of these cases are predatory, or there's something inherently predatory about these age gaps relationships, which I think they come close to, and they tell me it's likely to be like financial disparity, and traditionally this can be, but I'm not sure why in the overwhelming nature of consensual relationships of this matter it is something that is like weighing over, or that necessarily the stigma is going to be used to turn people away from these relationships in the first place, but also like towards better relationships. I'm not sure how this stigma is utilized to make people start dating people their own age. I'm not sure why people don't opt in with the stigma happening as we see under the status quo right now. And therefore just I think it is better when we do not have the stigma to solve some of the issues that can arise from these relationships. But I don't think these issues are guaranteed to arise. And therefore I side slightly with OG over CO.
So I would echo what Abbie says there. So I think opening government within their principal argumentation does a good level of characterization to suggest a lot of the things that opposition bench are going to point out are harms of different age relationships, like power dynamics, exploitation, dependency, are things that happen anyway in relationships that have their own norm attached to them. As in, obviously, normatively, we don't like power dynamic in relationships. So it's unclear why that is uniquely tied to same-sex relationships. Same age relationships, or different age relationships, should I say. And then secondarily, if it comes down to exploitative dynamics, indeed, as opposition whip themselves say, this maybe is changing people on the fence. If that is true, that implies that people are able to remove themselves of that relationship before dependency forms. If it's the case that it's the people who are always going to enter these relationships regardless, then it does become a question of is stigma is instrumentally useful. Now, CEOs here says that, well, your family will always empathetically care about you, so they're always going to have your best interests at heart. But I do think opening government is correct that then that requires people in that relationship to feel comfortable and open enough to reach out to people to recognize they are in a same age relationship. So without a response to opening government's claim about people opening up and how the stigma prevents people opening up when they're in a, say, different age relationship, that somehow is the prerequisite to getting closing opposition claim of how we can symmetrically help to improve people. So for me, that's the most important consideration is I think a lot of the closing opposition challenges here, particularly on how we can remove exploitative dynamics, has an unclear difference here. Because opening government self-identifies you can have exploitative dynamics in same age relationships as well. Is this sufficient? Are these two commentaries sufficiently for you, Noam, or do you have a specific question to follow up on that?
I think that I do understand the point. I agree that in general, the CEO even concede that those people who want to do it well will do it regardless of whether the stigma is there or not. So the main people that we want to treat here are the people that will probably not benefit from the stigma too much. The people that would like to reach out because it is problematic or something like that. And therefore, in this case, maybe it is better to go with OG. There is one point that they pointed out that still isn't resolved completely for me, and that is the point of like the biological gap of age difference, where a person can get stuck at some point. But I guess that it is niche enough to be still, that they'll still be fine with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I was saying just the two things to follow up. The first, I do think there are, as the closing opposition points out, problems of relationships that have different ages with each other. I just think opening government also identifies that there's sort of problems that can also exist within same age relationships. So even if CEO is pointing us for harm of their type of relationship, there's also an equal amount of harm in my mind to the other type of relationship. So I don't think it's sufficient to say the stigma should exist because this is harmful. It's more harmful than that, which would exist if you're in a same age relationship. I don't think they convinced me that that is true. But yeah. Cool.
Yeah,
Abbie, do you have
I'm
anything to
fine
add?
with it.
I
Cool.
think
Okay.
on the biology point as well, like I didn't really credit that much because a lot of the justification is just like, oh, you have like a biological predisposition to people the same age as you. They don't necessarily prove this enough to me because if this was just true, nobody would engage in like the age gap relationships in the first place because nobody would have attraction to people that are older than them. I think I just needed a bit more there in order to credit that as something significant within the clash there.
Cool. So then talking about, so that resolves the first of the two comparisons that we disagreed upon. Now look at the short diagram comparison rather. So Abbie, you have open opposition being close government, and myself, Noam, have close government being open opposition. So the same question that I posed to Noam, which is what do you think is the crux of the short diagonal comparison that determines, for your mind, opening opposition versus CG?
So I do think this is close because I have issues with both teams and how much they're able to prove within the debate. The main issue I have with CG is just that I'm not sure how much their case necessarily falls within the motion, and that this is a motion about consensual relationships, as it's stated within the wording of the motion. And therefore, when I have like an example of a relationship which is definitely not consensual, I'm unsure like how much this necessarily applies. I think OO is able to prove like slightly that there is going to be some like caution or pre-warning that sets in people's minds when they are opting into a consensual relationship with an age gap, that maybe this is something they ought to reconsider or ought to know like the issues about before they go into, and that is the like function of the stigma serves as a sort of benefit. Don't think this is proof like overwhelmingly, but I think it's still there. However, with CG, when I take away the example of sort of like the migrant brides, which I just don't think is a consensual example, so I don't credit it very highly, I'm unsure what is really left of the case there, especially what is not a direct knife to the opening and knife to the motion itself. However, like I do think their case is interesting, and so I would like to hear your guys' thoughts on this clash.
Cool. So now, do you want to take it away with what you think, especially responding to that, if closing government has something else other than the brides?
Yes, give me a moment. First of all, I do agree that the examples I don't buy well because I don't think that they fall under the motion, but I do get from them the gist of people come with prejudices. Those prejudices are a good explanation on why, for those specific people, it is hard to get away when the stigma is there and become even more dependent. I do buy their pushbacks against most of the things that OO say that the stigma is supposed to be doing. It is also a good thing against the COA as well, I guess. And that is the point that people do have other circles around them usually, especially when we're talking about consent. And I just understand better the impacts of what the stigma can do here and why it is wrong than the very, very vague thing that I managed to get from OO of people not looking for the correct relationships or thing like that in order to gain stability.
So the thing I would add here, and I genuinely agree with what Juan said, is the bride stuff I agree is sort of tangential to the motion. Even if I was willing to entertain that it has aspects of consent to it, I don't think it's just a characterization of the relationship can be materially useful, which is something that opening up has already said. I think the thing that CG is more interesting on is just the manifestation of the stigma and why it's harmful. Specifically, why the stigma may disproportionately affect younger individuals, particularly women, and how that creates a conception of self-inferiority, which means that people who it's basically an extension of people who reach out to help, but with just different mechanisms. How I think this weighs up against opening opposition is probably the same way that clash weighed up in top half, which is even if it's true, and I do think it is, that opening opposition gets away with saying the stigma makes some people more risk adverse into entering into the relationship. There's then for a question about if that is more important than when people do enter that relationship, whether or not they're able to get help if they need help. Because a lot of the debate, especially at the end of top half, is there's lots of problems that exist in relationships irrespective of age. It maybe is about how easy or harmful it is, or how easy or hard it is to get help when you need it. And then the stigma is just instrumentally bad because it doesn't allow people to get help when they need it. And the opening opposition response to this is, well, you will think about that before you enter into a relationship, which is probably true, but I don't know if it's that certain. I have intuitive problems, and the AIB would know that you can't perfectly foresee everything. And I don't think people could be expected to think the stigma would prevent them to entering into a relationship because it would make them realize they wouldn't be able to have help. Indeed, the levels of intuition I have about why people would enter into relationships as opposition with themselves says, but I think it's intuitive to an AIB for sort of irrational love reasons, and therefore it's probably better for these people, which I do think in terms of relationships probably applies to the majority of them, to have help within it, which is why I would prioritize what happens when you're in that dynamic as opposed to when you're about to enter into it. How do you feel about Abbie in terms of the two commentaries we had?
So I think I do have some issues still with the CJ case that I just like to get off my mind before I flip. Basically, I think when we take away sort of a lot of examples from CG, the analysis in terms of actor is actually quite symmetric to OO. And I think OO does do a lot of work to talk about like younger people being the ones that are more disadvantaged by this, that need the stigma more, because they're the ones that are more likely to be naive, and that like when you're entering these relationships, even though you have like the same mental capacity, you're not able to sort of formulate whether this is a good or bad idea. At the point in which you don't have any like societal narrative telling you this is a bad idea, it causes more harms because like you perceive yourself as able to enter these without any repercussion. So the issue I would have then still is it more likely under CG that these relationships turn predatory and you get this help. How is this distinct from OG necessarily if we're discounting a lot of their mechs for sort of falling out the motion? And then secondarily, how is this in relation to OO and saying that this is going to be sort of a warning that doesn't really exist otherwise in society? Sorry. If these two questions are like answered, I'm fine to flip. I'm honestly, I've kind of seen your point. I would just like to like
No, yeah, this is definitely fair. I think the reason why the analysis about what happens within relationships is potentially more persuasive to me than making people question whether or not they enter in the first place is leader of opposition themselves concedes that a part of this norm is that type of attributional bias, as in the way people think about it will be negative. And obviously they're using that to get to their full claim, right? Whereas I suppose closing government to an extent to say there are types of relationships where people are going to enter into it regardless because they need to, but then the government whip sort of makes it more wacky. But I don't think the mechanisms that they derive from their impacts depend upon their characterization. So even if we got rid of this sort of conservative inequality and argumentation about migrant labor, the mechanization about inferiority complexes and the way in which people who are likely to be already separated from types of communities, which I don't think only applies to immigrant communities, but could be a subsection of different people, still exists and is still sufficiently independent for me from opening government. It is become very close, and I agree with you here. It is very close about, is it better to have a stigma that prevents naive people from entering into a relationship versus having this type of sort of removal of stigma that allows people to maybe more likely reach out for help? Here it's just about how effective each of those two things are. And maybe this is just a difference of intuition. I think the stigma is more likely to stop people asking for help than it is to prevent people from entering into the relationship. This is just the intuition I hold on that comparison. And I don't think either team have resolved it beyond that, which is why I'm probably using my intuition. But before I go back to you, Abbie, Noam, do you have anything else to add here? We can't hear you, Noam, if he's speaking. Okay, so we'll go back to Abbie then, unless nobody can hear me.
Yeah, I think it's narrow, but I do see a reasoning, so I'd be happy to flip on that.
Okay, cool. So we're past the 15 minutes. Are there any other comparisons people thought were close and they think they want to spend 30 seconds talking about?
I think that's pretty much it.
Cool. So if we fill in the ballot then. So let me know, Abbie, when you have the ballot up.
I've got mine up.
Cool. So if we go from fourth to first, in fourth we had Min speaking first and second. I shall read out a bracket. Tell me if you agree. Arguments are almost exclusively relevant and address most of the core issues, but occasionally they slip into deficit explanation. Do you think this is a fair bracket for either of the speakers in opening, but either version of one speech in opening opposition?
I think this is fair. I think it would be sort of lower to middle end of this bracket.
Yeah, I probably think lower as well. So this would be a pair of 76s, unless you think one version of the speech is better.
No, I think they were probably the same.
Cool. Should we just mark the first? Oh, wait, mark the second as a duplicate. Any team that came third, which is causing government, we had Darrius speaking first and Daniel speaking second. Do you think they're within the same bracket? There's an argument for exclusive relevance, deficit of explanation.
I think they're probably the higher end of the same bracket. I think there's a big gap between the whip and the member, with the member being above.
Yeah. So do you think the whip was as strong as LO?
Yes.
Do you agree, Noam?
Is the weak was strong as LO?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Cool. So Darrius will be a 78 and the whip Daniel will be a 76. Good team that came second. So we had David speaking first and Louie speaking second. Same question again. So you think David and Louie spoke as strongly as Darrius, as in within the same bracket of exclusive relevance but deficits of explanation?
I thought they spoke around about the same as the member there. I think they were both pretty equal.
Do you agree, Noah?
Again, who between the two? I'm sorry, I have problems hearing.
Sorry.
Speak a bit louder.
Sorry, in terms of MO and opposition whip, you think they were as strong as member of government, so it should be a pair of 78s within the same bracket?
Whether MO and MG are similar, I think that they were quite similar.
Cool, so that's both 78, and then the team that came first, which was opening government. I do think the argumentation gets sufficiently into the higher bracket of addresses core issues and well made without obvious logical gaps and decently well explained. I do think, though, that the set of explanations for why the stigma manifests in a way that causes such aversion to getting help is something that doesn't have a strong explanation, which is why I wouldn't think it would enter into the 83 to 85 bracket, but would enter into the 79-82 bracket. Do you both agree, or do you disagree?
I agree.
Yeah.
Cool. Do you have a preference for either speaker, or do you think they largely satisfy the bracket of 79 to 82?
I think I have a slight preference for DPM.
Okay. Do you also have that, Noam?
DPM. I actually think that they have slight advantage to PM, but maybe it's the same. No, actually no. I'm fine with DPM.
See, I also had a slight preference to PM because I don't actually think DPM adds that much. I mean, maybe that's just because they don't have anything too much to do, but the core parts of the analysis and the persuasion of the analysis, I think, is rather member material, PM material. But I'm happy to say I'm just wrong. Yes, that's fine.
I'm fine with them being the same.
Okay. So should we get a pair of 82s?
Yeah. Can I just double check who was PM and who was DPM?
PM was Jim. DPM was Angus.
Thank you.
Cool. I'm going to reread the whole bracket to make sure we're agreeing. So PM was Jim in an 82. DPM was Panagis in 82. LO was the Min and the 60. That's like 76, and DLO was Min in the 76 with the second mark as a duplicate. Member of government was Darrius at 78. Daniel was government whip at 76. David was MO at 78. Louie was opposition whip at 78. All sound good?
Yeah.
Great. Could one of you get the someone bring in the other teams, please? If that's okay.
Sure, just message the main chat or
Yeah, if you just go into like the main room and just call people in.
Cool.
I think we were, what room were we? We were even called.
Yeah.
Cool. Do we have at least one member from each team here?
Yep.
Cool. So I think we're just waiting for OG, if I remember names correctly. Okay. Give them a minute. I'll also tag them just in case they went for a walk or something. Okay. I'm kind of impatient. So I'll start with general commentary, and then when they come in, they can tell me to come in. Okay. Just to make sure we got one representative from each other's team, right? We're not missing multiple teams. That will be a pain in the ass.
We're here.
So CO's here, CG's here, OO's here. Okay. Cool. Thanks everyone for the good debate. In terms of the way this works, general feedback, give me the call, and justify the call, bog standard. And the only point of general feedback would be, I think there is sort of a missing crux to the debate that I think some teams identify, but is never really perfectly executed or weaponized, which is I still am left wondering how this norm actually does affect people when they are wanting to enter into these types of relationships. So there's lots of teams that gesture sort of either assume that this norm only would affect people within the relationship, implying that would never change people's entry into a relationship, whereas other teams say it's like a soft part, a norm is softly coercive because it just makes people think about it before they enter it, versus more stronger claims about how it just prevents people from entering it into the first place. Whilst teams don't like hedge their case on either of those three realities, a lot more work could have been done to justify which is the predominant reality or which part of that reality you'd want to weigh to be true. I think that sort of would make teams' claims more robustly strong. But that wasn't really determined in the call. That was just an element of general feedback in terms of that burden. Cool. In terms of the call, we had some differences of opinion on close comparisons, but we did come to a unanimous decision. We gave the first to the team in opening government, the second to the team in closing opposition, the third to the team in closing government, and the fourth to the team in opening opposition. The conversations that we predominantly had were on the long diagonal and short diagonal, where we had the differences of opinion on those. And I'll try as much as possible to reflect what was interestingly close about those comparisons. Cool. So what's going to this? Let's look at the other comparison. Let's go through chronologically. So what happens on top half? I'm not going to summarize teams. I'm just going to explain the case interactions in the ways that are important. So the first then is a question about, does this norm actually change? Well, how in what way does the norm change people's behavior within and towards the existing dynamics? I'll engage with the consent stuff that opening government says in a second. The opening government says on their second core part of their claim that what happens is the attitudes that people have towards these relationships becomes bad. It becomes aversive and hostile, which means that when people enter into differently aged relationships, all that happens is they become less open and transparent that they're engaging in that relationship for an aversion or fear that they will be rejected. And then from that, not seeking help when issues may arise, that opening government says are existent throughout a vast majority of relationships that are not predicated on the age difference, like power dynamics, inequalities, toxicity, etc. Opening oppositions push here on attitudinal change. It's just to say people, particularly naive younger individuals, the stigma is sufficient to make them stop and think. And that is enough for them to then choose what to do correctly. So the opening government never really responds to this aspect of opening opposition's claim. And indeed, opening opposition concedes that a lot of the attitudinal things that opening government says, like aversion, are also true as well. How do then we weigh this consideration up? We think it is probably true both to the same level, that some people will stop to think about entering into a relationship. Maybe this is an aspect of good reparation to agency. But then some individuals that when they're in those relationships will not have the option of reaching out for help. The question remains which of these is more important. the question then gets resolved in the later portions of the clash, but there could be a cleaner way for teams to win by explaining why either of those two things are either untrue or insufficiently true. How does then this question get resolved? Which is when it gets to the the principled version of the clash, which is what would determine whether or not a norm should or should not be enforced. Opening government is quite strong here by saying consent, by demonstrating that consent might be the sufficient precondition for not having a norm against an action. Opening opposition then tries to say that the norm should be useful because there are aspects of the relationship that are bad and therefore justify the norm existing, as in like bad dependencies, different power dynamics, shifting tolerance of agency, differences of experience, different work-life balances, etc. I think opening government is very strong in pointing out that a lot of these considerations exist in types of relationships to which we don't either have norms against, as in normatively, even if we don't normatively disapprove of same-age relationships, even if there are power asymmetries within them. We have separate norms for that we think are themselves legitimate. So the norms against power dynamics and exploitation, they've said in opening government are, don't get excluded just because there is an element of different age. In actual fact, the aspects of there having a norm against differently aged relationships actually precludes a lot of conversations about the dynamics that exist in that relationship itself, because people are not open and transparent enough to identify the worst actors and behaviors, etc. So if opening opposition don't like, and as the debate can generally agree, we don't like bad dynamics in relationships, the consequential question of how we get around that is important. And opening government here are better able to demonstrate that having an open discourse within it, but feeling open enough to identify that these things are happening to people is important. Obviously, this doesn't still resolve the other lingering question in the first part of that clash, which is, does this actually meaningfully stop people entering into the relationship? I think it is true by this point in the clash that opening opposition are still correct, that people are more likely to opt out of, or some people maybe think more about the relationships they're about to enter into and opt out of the differently aged relationships from a consideration of power. But considering that opening government has generated, there is lots of reasons that exist beyond age to why power asymmetries exist. It's unclear that just because you're opting out of a differently aged relationship, you're actually opting out of a bad relationship in itself. Because you could enter into a same age relationship that has that same power dynamic. So even if people are opting out of it, it doesn't change this portion of the clash then. Because then the only asymmetry is the people who are within a differently aged relationship, and now because the stigma exists, can't talk out about the power hierarchies and discussions they have. Obviously, opening opposition's implicit retort is it's just a priori better to be in a different same age relationship because you can talk about this stuff, presumably, but then that concedes the opening government argument that the reason the norm is bad because it prevents people from being able to talk about this. At that point in the clash then, it is quite clear at the end of top half that the stigma either has no no legitimacy within its own right. That thing is never really challenged by opening opposition. Then I never receive a justification for why the consent for various reasons opening describes, as in similar neurological development and awareness of consequences can detect bad behavior, can apply past relationships, can apply information, can apply to other individuals, prevents the relationship from being legitimate. The only challenge here opening opposition does levy, which once again I don't think receives a strong response to, which it could have done, is leader of opposition does point out that there might be an insufficient level of experience some people have, particularly within that type of dynamic. So if you're 25 and this is your first age gap relationship, just because you've had previous relationships doesn't mean you have necessarily the sufficient information to do one of the METs that opening government describes, which is apply what you've learned before to now. But opening government has other reasonings to suggest that once you're able to open up to individuals and get checked back, etc., that may provide themselves a level of experience and accountability to get around the problem. But that is a good challenge from opening opposition, even if it's not a sufficient challenge because opening government has other reasons to support that claim, but is something that opening government could have done to defend against opening opposition stronger. So the end of the top half then, we don't think that this norm is legitimate in its own right, as in there are other situations which opposition would have to defend the norm also existing, which seem counterintuitive, as in we would oppose the same age relationships for the same reason. In fact, it seems that this is therefore illegitimate, and then it is consequentially illegitimate because it prevents people from actually seeking help in remediation. What is closing government's extension then? Closing government's extension is largely about margin and manifestation analysis. So they describe a different set of scenarios where there are people, in their case, younger or migrant women, who are disproportionately receive the hostility from the stigma, and in doing so prevents them from reaching out again. So they're largely arguing for the second part of opening government's clash. They do try to way to say they explain opening opposition's consent argument better than they do. I think this is true. The weighing is saying that the weighing was opening government needed to show that there was stigma to actually prevent people from making the choice. That would have made opening government's argument significantly stronger, but it wasn't a full contingency of the consent argument. The consent argument was just a legitimacy argument about what a norm, if the norm is illegitimately applied, which actually had nothing really to do with stigma. And not something, sorry, it did obviously have to do with stigma because that's the motion, but it had nothing to do with stigma changing people's choices, just the nature of stigma being harmful. And sorry, it's not harmful, being illegitimate. So what is then is the second part of that extension in closing government, and why is it insufficient to be opening government? There is different, you can take a charitable and uncharitable view for CG. So the uncharitable view is, not the uncharitable, like the less charitable view of closing government is, it's unclear if the relationships they're describing in terms about migrant workers, etc., are by their nature truly consensual relationships. Like if it's purely because you have no other alternative, like, are you going to die without this relationship? Is it truly consensual? Some people may think that is not a purview of the motion. Even if it is a purview of the motion, it is a subsection of individuals that we're talking about, which obviously is the POI challenge against you. I do think you defend this by saying all you're doing is telling me I'm defending a minority case. That doesn't necessarily mean it's unpersuasive. Why then is it that part? Why I'm going to explain why that part is less persuasive than opening government. The reason closing government's analysis is persuasive in the round is largely because of how you explain how people can't reach out for help. So when saying that migrant communities are already separated, otherized, there's an aspect of a self-inferiority, and that they are vulnerable in that relationship and they ought to have support. This is alternative mechanization for opening government's explanations that apply not only to migrant workers, but to everybody. So there's no real benefit here other than saying there is a set of people who are already excluded from society that now can't reintegrate with society. And thus we shouldn't have the stigma because it prevents them reintegrating. These people, as you already have argued, have the harm of integrating and getting help and support in the first place. So it seems unpersuasive or less persuasive than opening government to say this stigma prevents people from being able to open up if you yourself say these people don't have an option to open up to people. So it seems that the stigma is therefore just psychologically damaging. Fine. But then opening government's analysis would also apply to those migrant workers and everybody else. So they themselves don't just, as you mischaracterize, just say psychological harm. They do have mechanization to describe why it is psychologically harmful. They say that it's pre-framed as coercive, which legitimizes the legitimacy of that relationship. It means that you have backlash against that relationship. It means you can't feel comfortable when other people are around you because you think they are judging that relationship unharshly or imposing ideas upon you. Well, these are all things that come out in the 5th minute PM. So I do think there is analysis in opening government that you're mischaracterizing. Here, then, it would be a question about why your analysis of things like self-inferiority complex or your specific framing are more persuasive than opening government. There's no explicit weighing why this is true. Obviously, you don't need it, but we can't find an implicit justification for why that was more persuasive than opening government, particularly because we think opening government's analysis can apply to your case studies and universal case studies. The more charitable views, even if it is true that this is applying uniquely to a vulnerable stakeholder, as opening government themselves have justified, the legitimacy argument about why the norm is itself illegitimate does apply irrespective of consequential arguments, which are themselves have a margin to them that is uncertain. We do think opening government does sufficiently answer the question about what legitimacy is and why it is not met in this condition, as in why the norm is just illegitimate because the foundations of what creates the norm in terms of logic are just untrue or should be untrue. That just is a logical thing that we can apply to be true all the time, as opposed to the consequential argument that, sometimes it might be good, sometimes it might be bad, which is the weighing that opening government does successfully because they have the principle underlining it sufficiently demonstrated to be true. This would require more active attempts at weighing for closing government to be open government, in our opinion. When it comes to the closing government opening opposition comparison, this comparison becomes closer because it's the same sort of question happening on top half, but because the analysis is less universally applicable on being able to help for people to feel open enough to help, so open enough to reach out for help, the question becomes, is it better to have a norm that prevents people from getting that instance in the first place versus is it bad to have a norm that prevents people from reaching out? If closing government's arguments are couched largely in the terms of people who are already segregated and separated from the community, that aspect, this is the best-placed version of CG, doesn't really make any sense in the comparative to opening opposition and would be a reason why you would lose to opening opposition. As in, migrant workers have no other alternative in your world. If it is the case that stigma is preventing them from being able to access this, I don't actually think you justify why the stigma would prevent people from accessing it. You just claim it at the start of government with. People, and as opening opposition say, it doesn't necessarily prevent people from doing it to make people think about what's happening to them. It's either the case that maybe it prevents individuals entering into financially viable relationships, recognizing that I think DPM does also do some work here. So there's a question of new novelty to begin with, but independent of that, then the question becomes, what is better? Having a norm that makes people think about stuff, or makes people's life harder when they're in the relationship to begin with. A few ways we resolve, the fundamental way it gets resolved is once again on a level of intuition rather than level of analysis, is we think that the stigma is more likely to prevent individuals from being able to have help than it is preventing people who want to enter the relationship from entering in the first place. And this is the lack of analytical instantiation by opening opposition to explain why this is actually true. If opening opposition had done a bit more work to just justify why this is likely to be true, then the question might be entirely different on opening opposition comparative. But as far as we can track, it is left to a line. This is an intuitive line, but the scale of this line is unclear. Whereas I'm more clear why the severity of the harm for not being able to have help by the closing government analysis, which is different, that follows the same track of opening government analysis, wouldn't also be important to not have a stigma against. How does then closing opposition weigh into the round? Closing opposition takes the stronger responsive line than opening opposition, which is the first way they weigh above opening opposition, which is to describe that there are people who are on the fence, who this is actually going to change whether or not they enter into a relationship or not. The stigma would compel individuals, would push people to a same age relationship. This can be good for aspects of things like a shared life or cultural experience, that it's easier to emotionally bond these individuals. And there indeed is aspects of exploitative dynamics. A lot of this is quite similar to opening opposition, but there is couched in biological analysis, as in it is gesturing that there's a universal phenomenon. And we do buy that most age relationships will have an experiential difference, as in the problems you're facing will be different. And as a member of opposition says, that will harm your ability to emotionally bond to that partner. So when it comes to the mutual asymmetry in the round of what the relationships look like, opening opposition's stuff on exploitation, especially per what opening government said, has less mutual exclusivity, as in we think that a same-age relationship could have that problem, as opposed to closing oppositions, whereas being in different life stages and life experiences probably is more true or more differently true in a different age relationship than it would be in a same-age relationship. So it seems more tied to the notion that there is actually a difference between the two relationships that we now buy as a harm imposed. So in terms of the comparative harm position of a different age relationship, closing opposition, I think, is just more true at the end than opening opposition, and thus the harm is more we can bite down on the harm more. The second thing closing opposition does that I think is stronger than opening opposition is a justification for why you're able to receive help anyway. So they say that people will care, particularly your family and your mother, will care about you irrespective of the stigma in the first instance, and thus you're able to get a level of help anyway. What the stigma is actually doing is changing the opposed accountability that these people have on you, which is not imposed in a negative way, as in saying, how dare you do this, you exploitative person, but okay, in these dynamics, the stigma tells me that there should be these power dynamics are likely to happen. Let me look for them and correct against them. That characterization is quite powerful in the context of the round, because it's directly challenging the consequential parts of both opening and closing government. We think on the back half comparison, it sufficiently challenges the closing government's problem here. So closing government's argumentation is couched in people who are already separated from community. As we said in the short diagonal comparison, it's unclear how their analysis of how people are likely to feel more able to open up actually activates. So if we dislodge that analysis from that stakeholder and just apply it generally, as in people have a self-inferiority complex, etc., it becomes a characterization clash an analytical clash to which team on back half actually convinces us this is how people respond to the stigma. There's no reasoning in closing government to justify why, apart from it being disproportionately applied on younger individuals and there's aspects of conservative inequality in culture, as in the arguments of propriety or promiscuity would negatively apply to women, why the stigma, why people would not want to open up to the people. The reason for this and why this falls into closing opposition is that reason isn't actually couched in the motion. So it implies that the absence of the stigma, these type of people wouldn't receive help anyway. So it's unclear why the stigma uniquely activates a conservative inequality imposition upon women. Seems like absence of stigma, we're still going to view women, these people still view women and migrants in a bad way. It's not the stigma that's doing anything. Your argument is just the stigma gets worse for these people. fine, but that's the opposition to the stigma would imply that these things wouldn't manifest in different ways. That comparative analysis isn't done yet. So what we're questioning now is the people that this isn't true with, as in just holistically the people who are likely to respond to this by having an inferiority complex or feeling uniquely vulnerable or feeling unable to reach out. Why do people not ask for them to reach out? There's actually no real response from government whip to why what closing opposition says isn't true. They actually concede that family would care about you. So they say parents care regardless of what people think of you, which just concedes to what closing opposition say, right? They say stigmas won't prevent individuals from having bad dynamics and they'll be able to provide sufficient advice. So it means closing opposition are correct, which means people will, talk to you. If that is true, then the stigma focuses what people will think about, which is to look for power hierarchies, which is what closing opposition says is important, so that it brings accountability by making people aware of it. And then closing opposition has thus conceded that it isn't a harmful imposition, it's a caring imposition. And thus closing opposition accountability argument works, considering that we think this is the strongest contribution TG has about how people's behavior changes. This concession is quite damaging in favor of closing opposition, because it means that core mechanism about how families are likely to respond to you becomes true by concession. And thus, you're more conscious about the relationship, which we think is more applicable to this. The arguments of closing opposition about opting out into a different relationship are less persuasive to us for reasons that I think they apply, we're unclear how many times they apply, etc. And they're not necessarily the core contention of the round. On that then, the final comparison is a long diagonal one. There's lots I could say here, but the simplest justification is this. Even if we buy closing opposition entirely, that family and people who care about you will want to, if they know about you being in this different age relationship, to help you. You're not responding to opening government's reasons about why the stigma makes people who are in those relationships feel uncomfortable reaching out to people. So there's mechanisms in opening government that aren't just dependent upon how people treat you, the way you yourself interact with the stigma that makes you feel uncomfortable reaching out to people. That needs to be responded to before arguments of accountability exist, because the accountability forms after you reaching out. As in, the parent can't help you until they know you're in a differently aged relationship. They don't know that until you tell them and feel comfortable and open enough, bringing the person around and acknowledging that fact. So until you respond to why the stigma prevents those people opening up, the accountability argument doesn't work. If that is then true, then the powerful second part of opening government's case remains true, which is people in these relationships, because of the stigma, will not receive the help they want to. So your challenge of accountability, while I can see the strategy isn't beating opening government in the way it was beating closing government. The larger claim is therefore on the legitimacy of the narrative itself. Your challenge is to say these relationships are bad because you're not able to share community and culture, etc. As the POIs register, like, some people don't share culture, but we don't think it's illegitimate for them not to do so. As in, like, I might not share the same culture with someone who is from China, but it doesn't mean it's illegitimate. It shouldn't mean there's a norm against me doing that, just because it might consequentially lead to a worse relationship for us. And opening government's principal core arguments that are not reiterated do firmly suggest that it is illegitimate to do things like that. And thus, even if it's the case that the relationship is bad because of cultural differences, that doesn't seem a legitimate reason to have a norm against it. And thus, the principled argument also has a second path to victory over closing opposition. Cool. That is the round as we saw it. Took a bit of time there, but the debate was interesting. I like talking about it. If you have any questions, queries, or clarifications, I'll stick around. Good luck for future rounds.